wrote two books. One is a textbook for data integration.
Yeah.
The other one is called The Infinite Emotion of Coffee, which I think you probably had more fun writing. Tell us about the process of writing the coffee book. Would love to hear a quick story, of your process from ideation to drafting to editing to getting feedback. That'd be fun.
So I was actually writing these two books at the same time. Okay, the coffee book I started in 2007 and got published in 2012, and the data integration book I started in 2007 with two co-authors, and it got published in 2012. And the coffee book started was a shorter span of time within that. And they were completely different experiences, right? In one case, and I'll let you guess which one, publishers were like, "Oh, you're the world expert on this topic. We all want your book." In another case, like, "What the heck do you know about this topic? Go somewhere else." So the coffee book started from an idea. It started from an experience. I was going all over the world, and whenever I go to a new city, I would go to cafes. I would, do a few searches to see which cafes are recommended. But then I realized that the experience that I'm getting is it's usually good. It's really nice, but it differs from one country to another. So I started thinking about that, and I was like, okay, what is it about the culture, the local culture, that gets manifested in the cafes? So that was the idea that I started out with, and then what I did was I started telling a bunch of people that I'm going to write a book about coffee, having absolutely no intention to do that. And then these people started coming back and said, "So how's your coffee book going?" I'm like, and so then I started making a specific. So the idea that I had for the book was extremely vague when I started. It was like, okay, the culture of coffee. But then as I started reading a lot more, talking to a lot more people, I realized and writing a few of the initial chapters, right? So in the beginning, it was like, I spent a couple of days in Paris, went to a bunch of cafes, and wrote, every cafe in Paris has a history and usually a very juicy history associated with it. And so I was going to start writing that, but that became boring. Nobody wants to read about, Paris is special because it's got all these wacky cafes, but that doesn't carry over to other places. So then the question was, what is the unique aspect? What makes this book? What could make this book interesting and not terribly repetitive? And then I realized that the strongest chapters are the ones that start with some human story of somebody who's there. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, in Guatemala, I spent a week with this guy who later became the world barista champion. When I met him, he was only number 2 in the world. I met him right after he got second place. And his story, he had a fascinating personal story, and he's this very entrepreneurial guy in a country like Guatemala that is a great producer of coffee, so anchoring the story on him, then I was able to bring in some of the cultural aspects and how Guatemalan history has something to do with coffee. So anchoring it in a story of a real person was then what I was starting to look for. So and
that's brilliant.
So sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But yeah, it was, and now I definitely realize it. But even while writing the book, I realized that for me, writing that book, it wasn't so much about the book anymore. Mm-hmm. It was about getting to know an entire new industry, getting to know people that I would have never met if I just went to computer science conferences. It's getting to create a slight association between me and coffee and amongst my friends. So mm-hmm. It was much more personal development and journey than actually writing a book. The book now is almost 10 years old, and I'm like, that was just a ticket into a whole new set of experiences that I really am fond of.
That's so interesting, because I think you were passionate about coffee, and it's a personal journey, but writing almost give it like a purpose, right? Writing that book becomes a thread that ties all your activities together. Like when you travel to a different country, you will have an excuse to check out the local cafes.
Exactly. So the point is, when you start writing a book about something, the writing of the book may not be it's a way of getting somewhere. It's a way of getting a broader experience. Okay. But the book itself is one step and one artifact that you create in that process. So think of it as part of your personal journey. Okay, and that journey can have multiple facets to it. Meeting the people, maybe escaping certain unhappiness in your current life and giving it more of a purpose. Or it's a journey. It's going to take you to new places, and the book is just a way to sort of create concrete goals along that way.
So writing has been a key instrument for you at work. You've been a professor. You are a research scientist who has written and reviewed countless journal papers. You've won a 10-year Best Paper Award at Sigmod. You wrote 2 books, and you've been in many leadership roles in both academia and in industry. So I think being able to write well has been an important ingredient to the success you've had. Is writing easy for you? Do you actually enjoy writing? I remember once you said, if you have to write something, you will find time to get it done.
Yes. So there are 2 questions there. One is it easy? And the second is, do I like it? Easy is hard to say. I think it's easier for me than for a lot of other people. I enjoy it. So to me, when I write, I get into this flow of taking ideas from my head and trying to structure them in a way that I can communicate them to other people. And that process is something I really, really enjoy.
What motivates you to write? What's your typical goal for writing? Because writing is very expensive. You have to spend a lot of time. What's the typical purpose behind that?
Communicating something important to the world. So it could be, as a scientist, your major output, your main output is publications. Okay, it's the publish or perish paradigm. So if you can't communicate these ideas to your community, then you're blown out of the water. So it is your main. Now, obviously, doing the research and doing the experiments and taking that technology and maybe doing interesting things with it is equally important. But the way that you become a member of the scientific or academic community is by writing. Okay, mm-hmm. So that's writing for the scientific community. Now, sometimes there's within your organization, when you write something, you're organizing a bunch of ideas. You're setting a tone for. You could set a tone for an organization. You can set a tone for a particular line of work that you're trying to do. You can actually try to inspire people to work on something that you don't have the results for, but the writing convinces them that if they work on this, then the benefits will be very high. So it could be a call for action, or it could be a description of a result. And we do all that.
We sometimes say writing makes you a better thinker. What I guess you just described some of that in your earlier response, but how will you respond to that in the context of research? I remember when our team struggled to write a research paper, which happens quite often, you would say that sometimes simply surface the right question will make the paper worthy.
Yes.
So I guess you
So
will use writing as a way to understand deeply about problem and to share with people to further the discussion of that problem.
exactly. So so writing is like a mirror, right? Because you write something and then you go back a few hours later and it's like, what the heck was I thinking? Okay, or this is just not clear, or why am I doing this? And so writing and editing and when you write stuff, you start seeing connections between different ideas, and then you start connecting them. So you can see things when you write that you can't see when you're necessarily just thinking out loud or talking to people. And I think this varies a lot between people. So for example, in my case, I need to write in order to convince myself that the ideas are valid and well thought out and doing the right thing. There are people who can do this in a conversation, okay? And they can, they meet with their counterparts and sort of things happen. But for me, if I can't see it in writing, then there's something missing, because I know that when I write, I'm going to find out all kinds of issues that I don't find out in conversation. There's something about the level of detail that you go to in writing. When you have to formulate and justify every sentence. Why am I writing this? What might somebody think when they read this? What questions will come to their mind? And actually, that's probably one of the most important points in writing, which is when you're writing, you're taking your mind and you're putting it on paper, right? Or part of your mind putting it on paper. But what you really need to think about is what are people going to think when they read? What might be the associations in their mind that might actually steer them to read what you're writing in a very different way than what you intended? So sometimes you need to set more context, or you need to explain a particular term, how you're using it, or you need to fend off some related work by talking about it very early on. So it's just bringing the reader into the same frame of mind that you're in. That can be, actually, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that writers face. And most of us fail, because that's when we get peer reviews that we realize the peers did not understand what we meant. And it's like, we spent hours and hours writing this thing, like, what did you read? So you also have to make it in such a way that sorry, I'll stop in a minute, but you also have to think about the fact that the attention of the reader may not be all the time on high alert.
Right.
So don't expect that every single word that you write, they're going to completely internalize. So sometimes you need to repeat things, you need to say them in different ways, you need to reinforce a particular message, you need to refer back to something. So it needs to be something where the reader can sort of, not exactly doze off, but can meander attentionally during the reading. Of course, you want to write in such a way that they won't meander, because it's so interesting, right?
Right.
So you also want to give them like guides, like, okay, you're writing a paper, and now I'm like, the beginning of the section says, this is what the section is about, this is why you're reading it. Maybe that convinces them that they got the main message, and they can skip over the next section, right? So giving them hints as to what is important and what is the detail is also important.
Yes, I do notice this is one thing kind of particular about your writing. Especially when you give comments or when you review a research paper, you always focus a lot more on the why and just make sure to give people context so they understand the importance of this problem, and also have the enough background information so they kind of start thinking along with you. I think it often happens, and it's natural for writers to do, is to put all your ideas on the paper, just kind of turn them out, but really without really considering if the reader are on the same page with you.
Right. And the why is really important, especially in science, right? Because everywhere, it's like, why are you doing this? First of all, why am I asking you to invest time in reading this paper, right? And second, even if you don't get all the details from the paper, what is the consequence of what I'm doing, right? So sometimes you will say, if this paper really solves the problem that it set out to solve, that's going to be a major contribution to, or an important contribution to our field. I don't need to understand all the details, and in fact, few people end up understanding all the details. Not even the authors don't always understand. All the authors don't always understand all the details, which is fine. But it's the why that matters, right? Why are we writing this, and what are the questions that we're asking?
Switching gears a little bit and talk about note taking. I feel like you're talking about the why and the context of the problem. A lot of times I feel the most insights happened when you connect random dots. And so sometimes when I read something or when I experience something related to the problem, I always think I take notes down. And that kind of contribute to this, cohesively to this one problem I care about. And people talk about that a lot. But I think many writers, including myself, struggle with how do you actually connect the dots? I feel like, for example, in your case, you have a lot of knowledge, you do a lot of research, you talk to a lot of people. What's the thought process in connecting the dots? How do you actually build kind of a system, either in your head, or some people use a note system to kind of optimize result for connecting dots?
Yeah, so I'm pretty terrible at taking notes and maintaining notes. Sometimes I'll start a document, it'll be called notes, and I'll never look at it. So I think there's an opportunity. In fact, the fact that a lot of what I look at, a lot of what I read and I consume, I don't necessarily, I always feel like I don't retain enough, or I don't connect enough dots. Okay. And so that's why it's important to have multiple people looking at a paper, because they might connect different dots that you didn't see. But there are certain things that tend to bubble up. So here, let me give you an example, a meta example. I go around, or at certain periods of my career, I used to go around and give a lot of talks, and that is great because. So first of all, talks, you talk about what you're doing, but the questions that you get, and especially when you start getting the same similar questions a lot, they tell you what the next research problem is, right? So because you're essentially, by interacting with a lot of people and telling them about your work and having them react, you're essentially discovering what is the next frontier of research that you should do, and whether it's interesting, right? I mean, if the people start asking you very detailed questions that are fine, somebody will solve them. But if it's like bigger questions, then you start wondering, then you start connecting. The dots that I connect are usually the questions that I get asked. So I start hearing a lot of questions. Call it crowdsourcing my next research project. Okay. And that's how I tend to retain more and to connect more. Because when you're writing, you're thinking about these people and what are they going to ask? Or when you're trying to devise a new research project, you're like, okay, I know that if I answer this question, there are going to be a lot of people that would love to hear the answer, because they asked me for it already when I talked about something else. So that's why. So the advice would be, talk to a lot of people, get a lot of feedback, get a lot of questions, and remember those questions.
Right. So you are almost using You're using conversation for feedback and for signal.
Totally.
And you just keep all that in your head.
That turns out to be easier to keep in your head, because first of all, certain patterns emerge, And sometimes the reason it's easier is sometimes you can connect the question to a particular person or to a particular place that you went or a particular conversation that you had. And if it was an important enough question, it sticks. That's been my experience.
That's actually an interesting point you made. You said if it's important enough, it sticks. I think because your brain actually has limited memory, so you save them for the important ones. Whereas if you write them down, it's hard to actually prioritize. You just have a big list, but you lose the kind of the important ones.
There's another point I want to make, which is you're talking about connecting the dots, and so you can connect all the dots. It doesn't mean that drawing that connects all the dots needs to go into everything that you write. So it's one error that we often make is that when we write, we feel like we need to say everything.
Right.
Okay? That's a mistake. What you want is you want to focus on the message and talk about stuff that supports that message and around it, just to be scientifically solid. But you don't have to, just because an idea is related to this project that you're doing, it doesn't mean that it needs to be in the paper. So a paper is not the sum of everything you're thinking about right now. The paper needs to be very focused.
Okay. Is there a strategy around that? Because it's also important. You once said, I think, if you have to give one piece of advice about writing, that would be to write concisely. But that's challenging for a lot of people, because how do you decide what material is important and what's not? Especially when you're trying to explain a complex topic. And that kind of contrasts with what we said earlier about setting the context. Because, if you want to set a good context, then you want to kind of write more.
Right. So conference and journal, so we usually publish in conferences, and they do us a very, very big favor. Okay. They tell us exactly what page limit we have. Okay. So we're whatever it is, we need to fit it into those, whatever it is, 6, 8, 12, depending on which conference and which field you're in. Okay. And implicit in that is that you're discouraged from writing less than that page limit. So if the page limit is 8 and you're done after 7 pages, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not going to look good. Okay. So we know what length we need to write. That's not true when you're writing on Medium or stuff like that. But here's the thing. So the first thing you do is it's going to be very hard to decide what exactly to write before you start writing it. Because when you start writing something, you don't always know how long it's going to take you to explain it. It's just like you have the idea, but when you start putting it into words, it could turn out into one paragraph, it could turn into one page, and you don't know yet. Okay. So the first thing you do is you just write. Just it's called a brain dump.
Brain dump. Okay.
You just write down everything until you get, until you're written down everything you wanted to write. After that, and that's where being a professor is such a great deal, is you get to look at the first draft and make very profound looking remarks. Okay, because it's much easier to look at a first draft and tell somebody what's important and what's not important, but it's much harder to actually, come up with that first draft. But even if you're not working with somebody, you write it down, and then when you go over it, it'll become clear to you what things are more important than others. Okay, it might look like, and sometimes you need to make very hard trade-offs. It might look like in order to explain something as clearly as you want, you need 2 pages for it, but you don't have that 2 pages because that's not the main, it's only in support of the main argument, in which case you need to condense it into a couple of paragraphs and just say, look, we're not going to explain the whole thing. Here are a bunch of references to go read, but here's the main message. Okay. Or here is what is important to our message here. Okay. What we need to know from that literature in order to do what we're doing here. So it's much easier to to decide what to throw out after you've seen the whole picture of everything you want to write. That happens all the time. So when people get stuck, I'll always tell them, just write it down. Don't worry, just write it, and then don't. The advice is don't get too attached to any of your darlings. Your darlings being sentences that you wrote. Everything you write, it might end up getting nixed. So don't get too attached to it. Just realize that there is a process here that you're going to iterate, and something good will come out.
Right. So it sounds like the process is first brain dump, just write as much as you can. And then there's a big process of actually cutting it down, it, just pay attention to the important stuff. And that would kind of merge.
Right. And then you sort of, you should have an idea of what the main message of what you're writing is. That'll save you a lot in the brain dump. But after the brain dump, your main message will be much more refined. So the nuances of your message will be much clearer because they'll be on paper. Okay, so they're not in your mind anymore, and they're on paper. They have a quantity of text associated with them. There are all kinds of things that happen. So it's much easier to refine your message after you've done the brain dump.
Got it. Okay. Do you remember a time when your writing has improved quickly in a short period of time? What happened there? I mean, in a way, English is your second language. Even though your mom is from New York, you grew up speaking Hebrew and you did your undergrad in Israel.
Yes. I don't remember like a step function. Well, I never really had a problem writing in English. It just came, I was fluent. But I think after I wrote my first published paper, then I saw an example of what does get accepted. Okay. So that was important. And frankly, I think when you start working with students, then your writing role is different, because your writing role is to take the text that they wrote and take it to the next level. Mm-hmm. And then you're doing much more of the why part, making sure that everything that is written has a why associated with it, and just sort of keeping the tempo of the written document, right? Just like when people give talks, one of the common pieces of advice that you'll get is there needs to be peaks and valleys, right? If you're giving a talk for an hour, the audience is not going to sit there like, totally super concentrated for an hour, right? So they might even check their cell phone or something like that, right? But so you need to give them peaks and valleys. So the peaks, you need to tell them, here's something really important. Okay, if your mind is otherwise occupied, but you still want to get something out of this talk, okay, you need to tell them which part of the talk. When you get there, you say, okay, this is the important point, or you have to say it in such a way that will draw their attention. Same thing when you write. So every section when you write needs to start with, here is what this section is going to give you. This is the main result. This is what we're going to discuss, or we're setting this up, or we're defining the problem, and here's why it's interesting, or here is what, something that will distinguish it, or will give it an extra motivation. So that's so there's the technical stuff, and then there's the meta, or the peaks and valleys, or the rhythm. Okay, and you need to make sure that both of those are going really well. And sometimes it's even a matter of adding a bunch of images to the images or examples to the article.
Right. What from what you just described, I'm actually very curious about your editing process because I mean, these are probably questions you ask yourself, am I giving the audience upfront what they're getting for this section? Is there kind of a specific question list that you go through when you work on your draft? I think kind of from the brain dump version of the draft to kind of almost final draft, the whole editing process is pretty challenging for people.
It is. So you're asking specifically about editing.
Yes.
The first thing is it needs to flow. The sentences need to be correct. They need to be language that doesn't rub you the wrong way. Okay, it needs to be a little. It needs to be formal at times, but it also needs to be somehow inspirational or motivational, right? So that's one thing, and that's hard to put sometimes in the first draft. You get things like, are you building things? So are you using terms that aren't defined earlier? Okay, so that's really important. So if somebody starts from nothing, can they read this paper and at least all the things that you're introducing are introduced in the right order and with the right motivation? So sometimes even when you're writing theory and you're giving all these definitions, you got to say, why are these definitions interesting, right? Or maybe even something that happens is like, how are they different from something else that the reader may have seen? So sometimes, for example, you'll be discussing a technique, right? And you're going to describe it formally, but if you're talking, there might be another technique that is similar but different. And for certain experts, you can describe that difference in one sentence or two sentences, and they'll get it. Okay, you're still writing it, you're still going to write the formal description, everything like that. But if you can give certain people shortcuts in understanding your paper, that's where the intuition comes in. Okay, or sometimes you just give intuition. It's like, why is this working? Well, this is working because now the machine learning system is getting a bunch of signals that it didn't consider before. Okay, that's the new thing. Okay, so just giving the intuition that enables people to read it without actually having to understand all the details. There's another, I'm not answering your question, but I'm answering other questions. It's also important to think about what is the audience that is going to read this paper, or who do you want to read this paper or this article or whatever you're writing, right? And what is their knowledge in the field? Are they reviewing the paper? In which case you got to be really, you got to convince them, right? If you're writing some other article that isn't going to be peer reviewed before it gets out, then you don't have to convince anybody. When you need to convince people, you need to, dot a bunch of I's and cross a bunch of T's that you don't otherwise need to do. But that's the other question. What is the audience, and what is the knowledge and biases that they might be bringing to this, to reading this article?
Right. There are probably different ways to engage different type of audience, right? Make them feel inspired and interested to read.
Even the terminology that you use. When I go and read papers in natural language processing versus papers in databases, I'm using a different brain. Okay, there are just words that are used differently. There are things that mean the same, but they use one term and we use another term, and just the way their conceptual model of how things work or what kind of problems they look at, that brings a whole bunch of you need to meet the reader where they are, right? You need to understand their model of the world and place what you're doing in their model. And if their model is very dependent on a particular community that they're in, then you got to fit that. which is again why talking to people helps a lot, because when you talk to people, you're getting their model, and you can ask them questions on the spot, and after half an hour, you'll realize, oh, when I say this, they mean that, and vice versa. And when I want to explain this kind of problem, I need to use these words and this problem formulation, right?
Right.
So so you're going into the mindset of the reader.
Right. Yes, we often hear keeping your audience in mind. Know who your audience are is so important for writing. But I think that was a very good description of actually how to do that, keeping your audience in mind. Like when you read a paper from the machine learning community versus the database community, you actually are in different mindsets. I think that's pretty amazing.
It is, and it's yeah. And so you really need to be part of the conversation. So you just need to sort of feel comfortable. It's almost like natural, like languages, right? I mean, you can learn a language, but if you don't speak it,
mm-hmm.
then you're not really nuanced in it, right? So when you go to a different community, like in science, when you go from natural language processing to databases or to even to machine learning, which is closer to natural language, right? It's a different set of nuances and culture, and you need to be part of that in order to be able to write this.